This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted that former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal is joining me from London today to discuss what has been a really eventful day in Indian geopolitics. The G20 summit is happening in Delhi, and the Prime Minister of India has just announced that a consensus document, which many said would not happen, actually has come to fruition. That's why I'm delighted that Kanwal Sibal has joined me, and I want to discuss what the G20 means, G20 summit means to India and the rest of the world. And of course, beginning with this consensus document. Kanwal Sibal, thanks very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I want to begin by talking a little bit about the consensus document and its references to Ukraine. If you look at the document and its references to Ukraine, including to the question of transport of food grains from Russia and Ukraine and other such points, underlining, of course, Prime Minister Modi's old point about today not being an end era of war. What do you read into it?
Well, firstly, I am a bit surprised, but happily surprised that a consensus document has been agreed to and has been issued. I was a bit skeptical because the differences over Ukraine were so sharp, and the West had made it very clear that under no circumstances will they allow any joint declaration which did not condemn Russia or which did not actually align itself with the position of the West, largely speaking. The Bali consensus was no longer acceptable to Russia as well as China. So there was a clear confrontation between the West and Russia and China on this issue, which therefore meant that if the West insisted on its position and the Russians, supported by the Chinese, were unwilling to accept any language which would be condemnatory of Russia, then we have an impasse. Now, I must say, and I say this very genuinely with a sense of pride, that Indian diplomacy has really worked very well. I've seen the paragraphs on Ukraine. Uh, it is clearly a huge effort that has been put in by the Indian presidency to find common language. But I must also, to be fair, acknowledge that the West has been constructive, contrary to my expectations and the expectations of many, which were based on their own positions, which they had articulated repeatedly that they are not going to let Russia go scot free. But they have been constructive and they have agreed to a language which nowhere condemns Russia. Indirectly, there is references to the UN Charter, principles of UN Charter, not acquisition of territories by force, and things like that. But these are general principles, and these general principles are not necessarily uh, do not necessarily apply to the Ukraine conflict alone. They can apply to conflicts in the past, and they can apply to potential conflicts in the future. After all, China wants to take over Taiwan by force, doesn't it? Isn't it? so, so the West has been constructive in its approach, and I think the reason is that if the G20 had failed to issue a joint declaration, it would have been the beginning of the end of the G20, frankly. Because if the leaders cannot come together and address in a constructive manner all the challenges that are being faced by the international community, and those have been listed in the long joint statement that has been issued, and make everything contingent upon the condemnation of Russia, uh, then it is quite clear that the future of G20 would have been imperiled because the Ukraine situation is not going to be resolved tomorrow or day after. Is going to linger on for some time, and certainly into the next presidency, I think. So I think everybody realized that to keep the G20 functioning and alive and meaningful, uh, it was necessary to prevent its potential demise, and therefore uh, a joint statement has been agreed to. Uh, I think, on balance, Russia has won a considerable diplomatic victory because it was absolutely opposed to the idea or to any effort to condemn it uh, for its actions in Ukraine, and uh, and that position has been upheld in the joint statement. Uh, that is the other thing I think which must have weighed heavily with the West, the G7 and the EU, is that now there is a very powerful move by Russia and China combined to expand the BRICS. And already 6 new countries have been added. It has become G11. And next year, when the uh, summit takes place, BRICS summit takes place in Russia, in Kazan, there is a likelihood of further expansion. And this is an organization, a platform that has been set up as a counter to uh, the G7, and I would even say the G20, because there is no West Western member of the BRICS. It's all the so-called global South or what have you. Uh, and if that begins to keep expanding, then the G20 will become more and more sidelined. Uh, So I think the Western countries realized that in order to prevent that from happening, it was necessary to keep the G20 platform alive, in which the G7 and the EU and Australia are represented, as well as major developing countries of the global south. So that is another reason why I think the Western approach has been constructive. Finally, I would say that it is a personal victory for Prime Minister Modi, frankly, uh, because India was cheering. Uh, the Modi government put in tremendous effort in both in terms of organizational aspects of the G20, 200 plus meetings in 60 different locations, plus uh, introducing onto the G20 agenda the concerns of the global south. As you know that before the G20 foreign ministers meeting, uh, we took the initiative to convene a meeting of global south leaders. About 125 leaders attended that. Their concerns and expectations and priorities uh, were noted, and these were put on the G20 agenda. Plus, India itself puts many things of its own on the agenda, and the Prime Minister has been outlining what these are, whether it is the transformation of the digital economies or innovation or global health in view of the experience of the pandemic, or inclusive growth, or women's development, or how to progress the achievement of the SDGs or renewable energy, this global hydrogen initiative, and all that. Um, so we have also put a mark of our own on the G20 agenda. Now, if the G20 had failed to issue a joint statement, already there were voices in the West, in particular, and and some opposition in our own country, that it'll be a failure of Indian diplomacy, that India's prestige would be lowered because India wants to be a leader of the global South and puts in so much effort into the G20, and at the end of it, if unlike at Bali, no joint statement was issued, it was actually a setback for Indian diplomacy and for India as a rising power. So I think, in that sense, the US and West have been helpful in not allowing that narrative to uh, to take hold of take hold of internationally, and have, in that sense, uh, given Modi political and diplomatic support, so that India is in no way embarrassed, and can now say with confidence that it has succeeded diplomatically, and this is a feather in his cap. The other point to note in this regard is that both President Putin and President Xi Jinping decided not to attend. I think in the case of President Putin, there may have been good reason not to attend, because he may have feared that if he came, it will make the task of India very, very difficult. There'll be confrontation between the West and Putin, because Putin has been demonized. The fact that he was absent may have actually helped in forging this joint statement, and that if he spoke in the plenary session, the other leaders may have walked out, and he, so there would have been no possibility of any constructive uh, engagement between him and the principal players. Though, of course, it would have been a good gesture to India. But the absence of Xi Jinping, the reasons for that are more complex. And I think in his case, the Chinese have shown no inclination in the recent months to do anything which would, in a sense, create the right atmosphere for Xi Jinping to come to Delhi. Now, coming to Delhi after whatever they spoke about in the BRICS summit, which obviously was not productive enough, and subsequent to that, publishing this map, which again shows the whole of Arunachal Pradesh and parts of Ladakh as Chinese territory, in between issuing stapled visas, and then repeating their position that which actually makes it quite clear that they don't want to uh, diffuse the situation on the border. They want the relationship to be normalized otherwise, without making China making any concessions. Plus, I think Xi Jinping does not seem to be ready as yet to have a summit meeting with President Biden. Now, if he had come here and President Biden was here, it was inevitable that the two would meet. And maybe the Chinese felt it was premature for them, for Xi Jinping to meet Biden, because the stage is being set up for him to visit the United States for the APEC summit, and then engage in some kind of summit meeting with Biden, preceding which the United States has been sending a lot of cabinet ministers, U.S. cabinet ministers, to China to create the basis of some positive discussions. He may not have also wanted to give India a little feather in the cap, that it was on Indian soil that Biden and Xi Jinping spoke, and then some kind of forward movement in the relations uh, took place. Uh, and then, of course, he would have felt concerned that he may not get the kind of welcome that he thinks China and his personal stature entitle him to. Uh, Modi may not have actually sought a separate meeting with him. And if a separate meeting did take place and nothing emerged, it was a setback both to his diplomacy and our diplomacy. So I think for all these reasons, he decided to stay away. Um, but their absence, that absence of the two leaders, has in a sense also helped in forging this consensus document.
Come to the consensus document and the G20 itself in just a moment. Let's stick with China for a second. Some people also believe that one of the reasons Xi Jinping never came to the G20 summit in New Delhi is because the situation in China, economically and otherwise, is steadily worsening. You know, and of course, most recently with the floods in Hong Kong, there's been a lot of bitter criticism of how the Hong Kong administration is being run by the Chinese Communist Party. So the overall atmosphere is quite, in a sense, volatile, which is the other reason why he didn't come. Would you agree with that?
Frankly, no, because I don't think these are important enough developments for Xi to feel insecure about coming to a G20 summit. In fact, he has sacrificed a lot uh, because the G20 summit has obviously been dominated by the U.S. president and other leaders, and China is nowhere there. Even in the coverage of the G20 event, China is is being ignored. So, in that sense, unnecessarily, from my point of view, uh, well, I won't say from my point of view, unnecessarily, um, Xi Jinping um, has isolated himself, uh,
You think
and
it was a mistake?
I think it was well, from the Chinese point of view, it may not have been a mistake, but from the international point of view, it certainly is a mistake because look, China wants to be now a peacemaker. It's on a peace offensive. It talks about all that it has done in bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. It actually even took the step, which was a bit surprising, of trying to be some kind of a mediator between Russia and Ukraine by sending his special envoy on for Ukraine to both these countries, and nothing came out of it. Now, rather than trying to make peace far away in areas in which it is not directly involved, only indirectly involved. It is incapable of taking a peace initiative in an area in which it directly involved vis-a-vis India. So let him first say or create uh, more credibility for himself by making some gestures towards India to diffuse the situation, and and then give credibility to his international peace offensive as a country that looks to resolve differences and bring opposing parties together. So why can't he do it between India and China, which is an immediate issue? So his absence, therefore, reduces his credibility. That he is not ready to make peace or take any steps towards diffusing the situation with India that would have made it possible for him to attend and get the right kind of welcome in India. So I don't think that it helps Chinese diplomacy. So those who say it was a snub to India, I think the Chinese have succeeded in snubbing themselves.
Must have heard with attention comments made by the Chinese ambassador in Nepal recently. Comments which seemed particularly acerbic about India and in India's situation, its position, and so on and so forth. Some people have read those comments and the openness with which those comments were shared as a marker to what you were just talking about, that China does not, in fact, want to make any effort to build any kind of consensus or bridge with India at this point in time. If that be true, why do you think it's true?
First of all, I don't know what he said, but can you tell me what precisely he said, or
So
in a gist?
essentially, he said that, look, I mean, India is still so poverty stricken, and they came out of this COVID pandemic, and their recovery was so poor. What can India really offer Nepal? It can't offer Nepal anything compared to what China can give, and this, that, and the other.
Complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. Of course, he was trying to stir up those political circles in Nepal, which are traditionally anti-Indian. I've served there, and I know how difficult it is to handle Nepal politically because they play on both wickets. And they've done it for decades, and they've done it successfully. And India is in a difficult position because if it presses Nepal, then they we push them more into the arms of China. And if we don't do anything, if we are soft and if we are accommodating, then they think there is no price to pay, and nevertheless they go and then embrace China, which they are doing. But I would read the Chinese ambassador comments as something which is worrying them, uh, something which is unsettling them, which is Prime Minister Modi's overtures to Nepal. The fact that the Prime Minister of Nepal came here I had a very successful visit. Even as an ex-communist leader, he visited temples in Ujjain and everything else. And a lot of projects that have been put on the anvil, connectivity projects, in order to draw Nepal southwards towards India rather than leave the field open to China to develop connectivity towards the north. But leave that aside. Even if they connect uh, Tibet with Nepal, what has Tibet got to offer? I mean, Tibet produces nothing. And does China want to trade with Nepal through Tibet? Look at the costs involved. Look at the costs involved. And and Nepal is a very small market. So it, it is just that they are now feeling a bit insecure that India is clawing back uh, its position in Nepal after the differences that occurred some time ago over the border closure, so called, and the map that the Nepalese issued. Um, and that is the reason why there is this kind of flustered ambassador of China and Nepal who's making these idiotic uh, statements. Uh, Nepal cannot survive without India, and Nepal's survival is not dependent on China. China cannot support Nepal. China can play uh, a, a certainly a negative role for us in Nepal, no doubt, which it has been playing. It can undermine, and it has done so already, Nepal as a buffer state between India and Tibet. And of course, China has its own concerns with regard to Tibetans who are coming into Nepal, who have come into Nepal and want to keep tight control over these elements and also be in a position to monitor and prevent any refugee flows of Tibetans into Nepal, etc., etc. Otherwise, I don't think uh, beyond creating problems for us in Nepal, China has any great geopolitical ambition there, uh, unconnected with its issues with India.
So then come to G20 question, Mr. Sibal, and I want to ask you, how do you look at India's G20 efforts? We just spoke about the fact that there were 200 engagements across, 60 locations. India really went all out to make this G20 event a big deal. In a sense, is this India's coming out party as a rising power?
Uh, in a sense, yes, I think like the Chinese used the 2008 Olympics to to as a coming out party, as you said. For us, Prime Minister Modi, right from the start, decided that this will be the coming out party for India. Just as China in 2008 had already acquired the economic muscle and its economic capacities by then sufficiently, and its manufacturing capabilities, that was the right time for it to put its mark on the international stage more visibly. Similarly, for India, because it is economically now already the fifth largest country, slated to be the third largest by 2027. It is the fastest growing large economy. Relationship with the United States is expanding very rapidly into very critical areas, technology areas. Uh, India has now established very close ties with the conservative uh, regimes in the Gulf. In fact, the Saudi Crown Prince will have a state visit just after the G20 meeting is over. Uh, Plus, very active uh, in ASEAN. We're part of the ITU2. We are part of a new uh, quad in the West, which is Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, and Israel, I think. And generally speaking, uh, India, because of the manner in which we have tried to put our mark on the international scene by wooing the Pacific Island states, by wooing the Caribbean states, now taking the lead in making the African Union, proposing a permanent membership of the African Union in the G20. All these things has given India uh, an opportunity to put its mark on the international scene. Plus, of course, one should mention, in terms of digital transformation of the economy, uh, I think what India has done is remarkable, and by this is being accepted by the World Bank, IMF, other countries. How this can be a productive model for developing countries in general. Um, so, in that sense, yes, the circumstances were very favorable for India at this point in time to make the most of the G20 event, uh, which uh, which we have done.
Some people say that the question to ask is, where does India go from here? It's had a very successful G20 summit. It's managed to even drive a consensus where many people thought a consensus would not emerge. Where does it go from here? You mentioned, of course, that there would be a Saudi state visit. There is talk, and we noticed that it was the Indian railway minister who went to the airport to receive the Saudi prince. There's talk of a major infrastructure move involving many countries, connecting the Middle East and India through a railway line. Some people see this as one of the counters that India and others are building to China's BRI projects. Where does one India go? Where does India go from here?
Well, I think India will continue to pursue the policies it is pursuing, which is that uh, forge closer ties with the United States, with Europe, with the Gulf monarchies, uh, do these connectivity projects which you have just mentioned, which have huge potential. Uh, but at the same time, maintain its very close ties with Russia, uh, put its focus also on the international North South corridor, uh, which the Russians now are pushing much more, and Iran is cooperating because of the sanctions on Russia and the need for them to find alternative channels for their exports and economic ties, etc. We will do that. Similarly, uh, Prime Minister made this special effort, even though he was going to chair the G20 meeting, to rush to Indonesia for the East Asian Security Summit and the India ASEAN dialogue, which also indicates that that part of our Look East, Act East policy is being taken very seriously. With Africa, as you can see, we have stepped up our engagement. Mind you, in Africa, America now is trying to recover a lot of ground to face the Chinese challenge. The Europeans are, the French in particular, and China, in any case, as we know, has made deep inroads. And now Russia is trying to recover the position the Soviet Union had in Africa. They had this St. Petersburg meeting where lots of African leaders were present in order to show that Russia is not isolated. So everybody is focusing on Africa, and we are there too. Uh, Plus, in the digital domain, uh, making the rupee more and more a medium of exchange, uh, trade exchanges with other countries. We've begun with UAE, with Singapore, and in a very, very, very small tentative way with France. Um, with France, as you know, the state visit was very successful, and with France, we've always had a very wide-ranging relationship. And France is becoming even more critical for us in Europe because Germany has lost ground tremendously. Uh, Germany, frankly, first of all, their economy is not in good shape, and the outlook is not very good. Plus, whatever little Independence they showed in foreign policy at the time of the Iraq conflict in the past, that has collapsed. Now they are taking the dictates from from Washington. So, in geopolitical terms, Germany cannot be the main partner or a significant partner for India in Europe. Um, and with this economy in trouble, uh, even the outlook on that front um, may not be as fertile as we might think. So with France, although the French economy is also not doing too well, but with France we have much wide-ranging um, strategic relationship, and France therefore will be a critical partner for us in Europe, and hopefully this FTA with Europe will progress well. So in terms of what India will do going forward is, frankly, to sum it up, is to maintain friendly ties with all countries, keep the dialogue open with China also, because that helps us to preserve what we want to preserve, which is our strategic autonomy. Uh, we are not. We are also in favor of multipolarity. We may want to be very close to the United States, and we are becoming close. But that does not mean that we don't want a more democratic and a more equitable world order, which therefore means that while we become close to the West, we will continue to function constructively within the SCO, within BRICS, so that the larger objective of a cooperative multipolarity and a distribution of power within the global system, uh, moving from the West to the East, and a more balanced international relationship, more balanced international order, that will be our goal.
Point I want to ask you. I want to return to the infrastructure question in just a moment, but I want to ask you. Some commentators have recently pointed out that perhaps the BRICS, gathering, so to speak, will not give India what it wants in the future. As the BRICS expands, there will be many countries who have extremely diverse, sets of priorities. Many countries that are authoritarian, and what India would get out of that gathering would not be clear, and its tangible benefits would not be clear. Do you buy that logic?
Not at all. When it comes to authoritarianism, okay, there are two kinds of authoritarianism. One is authoritarianism within countries. One is authoritarianism on the international stage. So, what authoritarian are we talking about? I think we have to combat authoritarianism on the international stage, and that's where BRICS and everything becomes important. Number two, after all, BRICS has survived for good or for bad, despite fundamental differences between two of its key founders, China and India. And if despite that, BRICS has been able to function and have some credibility, uh, I think with the inclusion of additional partners, even if they have differences amongst them and have different priorities, uh, BRICS will be able to function. Now, look at, for example, G7. It's not as if the G7 are agreed within this group on everything. On the contrary, Europe is feeling there's a lot of anti-American sentiment developing in Europe in many circles, and they've had differences in the past and will continue to have differences on economic issues, even on security issues. Look at what President Macron is saying, that we don't want to be camp followers. They're not at all happy at the way China is dealing with, US is dealing with China on the Taiwan issue. They don't want to be pushed into a conflict with China because the United States has a certain view and certain policy towards China. So there are serious differences there. So why is it that difference is there? Now, for example, even during Trump's presidency, the manner in which Japan was so worried about Trump's overtures to North Korea. They were extremely nervous. Abe kept running to the United States to be reassured that nothing would happen which would imperil the security of Japan. Uh, so it's not as if uh, And therefore, if there are going to be differences between countries in an expanded BRICS group, it is a fact of international life. But nevertheless, beyond that, there is a global international agenda on which things can countries can agree. Look at G20 itself. There are serious differences in the G20 with North, South, East, West. Yet you look at this 37-page joint statement that has been issued, which covers the entire gamut of all the concerns of the international community, and they've been able to agree on this. Similarly, in BRICS, despite all these differences, they'll be able to forge a consensus, a broad consensus on issues on which there are shared interests. Now, there will be one or two difficult issues. In the case of Iran, for example, its relationship with the United States, the sanctions policy, and everything else. They have a particular position on Palestine. They're very aggressive. Even the Gulf monarchies are not. They might want to push a little bit in that direction. But that doesn't mean that if a country has a particular viewpoint on a certain issue which is not shared by others, it can have its way. No. Some kind of uh, common language can always be found which reflects the basic concerns of these countries, which basically boils down to very simply multipolarity, which actually should not, from the Indian point of view, mean being anti-West. It should just mean that there should be a more democratic and equitable international order, which is not the case today. Which is not the case today. And the manner in which the West has handled the Ukraine crisis, which from the West's point of view may have been logical given their concerns about the European security architecture and everything else. But for the rest of the world, the what the United States has done in weaponizing finance, unilateral uh, sanctions, confiscating of foreign exchange reserves, gold reserves of countries, uh, confiscating uh, the property of individuals without sanction of law. All these things down the line will create concerns in other countries that we should have a system where this kind of arbitrary action is not possible. But let's see.
What would therefore come to the other argument that has been placed this week that, well, even if India has a successful G20 outing, what can India really do in proving that it can be a leader of the global South? And the crux of that argument is, materially speaking, it doesn't have enough to offer to the global South as China does in terms of money, in terms of infrastructure, and other assistance. Do you buy that argument?
Well, first of all, we are not in competition with China, nor should we be in competition with China. We have our own strengths, and we should work on those strengths uh, with the global South countries. We are not in this infrastructure business, though in our neighborhood we are doing that, but we don't have the capacity to do it uh, elsewhere on the same scale as in China. Number one. Number two, while China has done all these infrastructure projects, but there's a lot of resistance growing. I mean, we were the first to oppose the BRI, and the language that we use on the BRI has now become the language of the international community. In fact, in all the joint statements that are issued here and there, when it comes to connectivity issues and this and that, uh, the language is taken up about the deficiencies of the BRI structure. The debt entrapment and financial norms are not followed. Decision is opaque. Decision is opaque. Uh, Decision making is opaque. Actually, all the decisions are taken by China, and it's not as if there's consultation with the countries about what the projects they need. It is what the Chinese companies require in terms of greater market access and using this excess capacity, which then uh, decides primarily what the projects China will finance. And then the Chinese projects are have very little grant element. In fact, one believes that first of all, one doesn't know what the interest rates are. Pakistan had that problem. The IMF wanted to know. what the interest rates were, but the Pakistan is refusing to divulge that because they're higher than the whatever the international rates are. So things like that. So there's a resistance in some countries to BRI, keeping what happened in Sri Lanka and Hambantota
Many of the
in
loans are
mind.
going bad. I mean, the Rhodium Group in the US has calculated that exponentially large numbers of these loans under BRI are becoming bad loans.
Exactly. So therefore, the BRI is not is really a model which is which can which can be projected as the best form of assistance to the global south. India, in terms of capacity building, education, health, the digital area, things like that. Uh, we are doing that fairly successfully, and there is no backlash. That is one. The other is that now we are joining hands, although it has not proved very successful so far. America and India joining hands, France and India joining hands, Japan and India joining hands to see what they can do in terms of connectivity projects in the global south as such. This is not going to be easy because to marry the interests of companies of diverse countries in an effective manner doesn't work out as well as you might imagine. But anyway, uh, but in terms of the leadership of the global south, I think we have to be a little careful about talking too much about leadership of the global south. The global south resents any country which wants to take leadership. That leadership should come without it being noticed. That the countries should look up to India for what India can give them, without without their feeling that India is patronizing and wants to be a leader. Now, Africa has the African Union. The African Union has become a permanent member of the G20. It's 55 countries, I think, in the African Union. So, who will take the leadership of these African countries? The African Union or India? So, countries like South Africa, in fact, are being pretty active. They took a South African president took a delegation of African leaders to Moscow to represent the concerns of the African countries about the consequences of the Ukraine war. They did it independently of India. Uh, Similarly, in the United Nations, uh, the African Union decides on candidatures and etc. 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 So there again, that kind of leadership within the United Nations UN General Assembly is left to the African countries, the Latin American countries, Brazil being a very powerful country and a leader there now. Argentina has joined BRICS and everything else. They have their own role in terms of promoting their interests. ASEAN, in fact, if you know, if as you can see, it has a very well-defined personality, very well-defined ideas. They want to be the hub of any future ASEAN Asian security architecture. Uh, they decide they are very careful in not wanting to fall in between stools when it comes to China and the United States. What leadership can India give them in this regard? They're going to decide as ASEAN. So I think we have to be very careful when you talk about leadership of the global south. Now, if you say leadership of the global south in a very restrictive sense, that India got the opportunity to chair the G20. And since it was chairing the G20, it wanted the concerns of the global south to be put on the G20 agenda. That the G20 agenda should not be entirely dictated by the policy and preferences of the G7 plus the EU, and therefore consulted the leaders of the uh, global south to see what their expectations and concerns were. So, in that sense, a leadership in terms of the G20 deliberations is fine. But for the rest, I think we should continue uh, our long-standing policy of reaching out to the uh, developing countries, to the global south, forge economic ties with them, build political support uh, from these countries to for our aspirations in the United Nations and elsewhere. Uh, when it comes to election in the UN, whatever, these countries are very important, and our future is certainly linked uh, to a power shift from the north to the south. So, in that sense, whatever role we can play, not as leader of the global south, but as a major country of the global south, as a preeminent uh, country in many ways in the global south, we should play a role. China is actually not a member of the global south. It has never been. Even when it comes to G77, it is G77 plus China. China has never considered itself as part of the global south. They have a very hierarchical, hierarchical way of thinking. They want to be the top of the heap. They want to have a G2. They are not interested in this global south business except to leverage their financial and economic power to bring the global south countries into their fold in order to be able to challenge the United States of America. That is not our ambition.
Talk about two things. First, the entire bit about Africa, which you just mentioned. The African Union joining the G20 in this G20 summit chaired by India has been, taken as a certain moment, so to speak, where the influence and the importance of Africa is being brought on the table in many ways, not just for today, but actually also as a block of the future where future global growth will come from. India's ties with Africa seem to be growing too. How do you see that?
Well, India, as you know, took the initiative to make the African Union a permanent member of the G20, and Prime Minister said that in his speech, in his remarks to the G20 meeting. So, to that extent, India has strengthened its credentials as a supporter of the global south. That is one. Number two, in terms of the leadership of the global south when it comes to G20 discussions, the African Union will speak for itself, and they are a major part of the global south. Uh, so, th- so therefore, we shouldn't have that feeling that we want to be a leader, and it is through us that the concerns of the global south should be reflected on the global stage. That is number three. African Union is there, like the European Union. European Union uh, has a lot of internal issues. In fact, many now wonder where the European Union is headed, and this despite the fact that they have a great history of working together and civilizationally, culturally, in they're very they have a lot of common commonalities. Uh, they are It's a small continent, uh, and they they want to build. They have built Europe based on their values, uh, and of course they want a peaceful Europe, given the background history of war. But Africa is extremely diverse. I mean, there is Africa north of the Sahara. Then you have the Africa south of the Sahara. There you have West Africa. You got East Africa. You got Central Africa. You got Southern Africa. Uh, Parts of were colonized by the French, parts by the British. In the past, some were Germans, uh, etc., etc. Uh, so I don't think that. And then, of course, they have these various economic organizations within Africa, uh, various geographical parts of Africa. Um, they are trying to work together as much as possible, but it's not easy. I mean, look at our own South Asia. You know, it's just a handful of countries, and look how it's difficult for us to work together. So to expect that the African Union, simply because in African Union, actually means they're united, I think not being is not being realistic. The
Do you
point
think
is that
growing ties, do you think growing ties, as we're seeing, say, between Egypt and India, for instance, suggest a new move? And also, we know that the Chinese have been very active in Africa for a long time. Do you see, in a sense, India countering that at the moment?
I don't think that we should base our policy on countering China. I mean, our interests in Africa are not determined or linked uh, either in the past or today uh, to China. We have independent interests in Africa. We have had long ties with Africa. We've had huge people of Indian origin who have lived in parts of Africa. We now have a growing trade relationship with parts of Africa. Uh, some of our companies are very active there. So we should pursue that trajectory. And if pursuing that trajectory helps us to balance China, so be it. But China will do what it can. It has the resources, it has the ambitions, and and uh, I would say that the manner in which China operates in Africa, I don't think that they win too many friends because they bring Chinese labor to work on projects there. They're isolated culturally. They are very different from these countries, and they keep their cultural exclusiveness. Uh, uh, they, Culturally, I don't think they are able to relate as easily to the Africans as perhaps the uh, Indians can. But anyway, I don't think for us we should, to sum it up, uh, be obsessed with China, its policies in Africa, and its penetration of Africa, and that should be the motivation for us to expand our ties with Africa. The motivation for us should be independent of China, and some countries in Africa are growing very rapidly. Uh, we understand the importance of Africa. Prime Minister has visited a few countries. He went to Uganda. He, he went to Kenya. He went to uh, Rwanda in one of his visits. Uh, South Africa, we have traditional ties. I think we should continue to build on that.
Let's talk about the Middle East. We began this conversation referring to
But
the
excuse me,
related.
you talked about Egypt. Now,
Yes.
Egypt, uh, Egypt's issues basically are in what we call the Middle East or West Asia, in the sense traditionally the whole Israel-Palestine issue. Now, of course, Libya is a big issue now since Libya is next door, and Egypt has a lot of interest in in, in Libya, and then of course Ethiopia and Egypt because the River Nile flows through Ethiopia into Egypt, and Ethiopia is building this huge hydroelectric project there, which is a cause of deep concern to Egypt. It's always been from the time that I was ambassador there. I have some feelings about that. Uh, uh, so Egypt, but further afield, further afield, uh, Egypt doesn't have much of a role in Africa south of the Sahara. In the Arab-speaking part of North Africa, including Sudan, yes, Egypt has a role to play. So our relationship with Egypt uh, is based on a few things. One, of course, is the old ties that we had with Egypt. Number two, Egypt remains the strongest Arab power, militarily and culturally. There are a lot of economic prospects today. We are doing huge investments in the green hydrogen in Egypt. There's interest in the defense sector. Uh, Both sides want to build a stronger relationship, but that dynamism is essentially bilateral and not so much, to my mind, uh, inserted into West Asian politics, because there the players really are the Gulf monarchies, and Iran and Syria
And that's exactly the region I wanted to. Sorry,
and
sir, please
Iraq.
go on.
Mm, and
And that's
Iraq.
just the region that I wanted to come to, the Middle East. We began this conversation talking about, as I was saying, this railway line that is envisaged from the Middle East to India. A lot of activity happening across the board. UAE, Saudi Arabia, India-Saudi ties seems to have, gone into an overdrive also. Talk to us a little bit about what you see happening there.
I think it's a visionary project. It can be a very successful one, because these countries, first of all, the trade route through this region connecting us to Europe uh, would be potentially of great interest. That is one. But other, other than that is in the perspective of the FTA with the UAE and the growth of our economic ties, uh, and then the plans that these countries have. If you look at their 2030 projects, vision, of Saudi Arabia or UAE, the massive, massive projects that they have in view, massive investments, development prospects. India wants a share of that. Now, once you create this kind of connectivity, then you can better access these markets and increase your presence in these areas. Uh, the other thing is this food security. These countries import food. India can be a big source of supply of food to these countries, and this connectivity will also help in that direction. So I think it's a very good project, but we are at the very initial stages, at the conceptual stage, and let's see how it goes forward.
We come to the end of this conversation, Ambassador. I want to talk to you, bringing conversation back to the G20. Um, we began by saying, and that the G20, India hosting the G20, in a sense, was a coming out party for India, like it was for China in 2008. There is a big election coming up in India next year. And surely such events speak equally to domestic audiences as they do to international ones. There seems to be consensus building in India, which seemed to be absent for a long time, that finally the recognition that India has a destiny as a global power, it is a rising power, and there are certain things that rising powers need to do. Tell us a little bit about where India goes next in terms of defining its route to rise, so to speak. What are the next steps? One, of course, is economic. Getting to that 5 trillion, 6 trillion would be critical by 2030. What are the other challenges and solutions that you see? You mentioned number of times in this conversation digital public infrastructure, and that, of course, is one big thing that India is not only doing for itself but also offering to the world. You just mentioned food. What other aspects of India's rise do you see now that has to be underlined both internationally and domestically, so that there is greater consensus in going forward on its path to rising?
Well, one is the shifting of supply chains. Uh, there are now concerns about China more and more, and they want to shift supply chains away, uh, and have the China plus one strategy. We've not been able to benefit from that to the extent that we should have uh, been able to. But then, with all this Gati Shakti and all the infrastructure projects that we are having, we are creating the basis for the supply chains to shift to India, because some of the deficiencies in our infrastructure, in our in the way we handle certain issues, well, whether it's land acquisition, this and that. So all
Logistics and
these,
so on and so forth.
things, if we can address, we will inevitably see more and more companies installing themselves here. Number two, in the in the emerging and critical technologies, uh, India has acquired credibility, frankly, um, and in some subtle ways which are not directly connected. Well, let me put it differently. In subtle ways which may not be material, but which affect psychologically, which is that the heads of the most of the important IT companies, technology companies, are people of Indian origin. So that actually strengthens the belief that India has very capable human potential. And now with the rest of the world, the advanced economy is growing, aging, and needing trained manpower. I'm currently in Europe. I had a chance to. I was in France earlier. Uh, the kind of uh, the manpower they need, trained manpower they need, skilled manpower they need, because they can't support their lifestyles, their economies, unless they have enough manpower. And that's where, if we can have skilled manpower to offer to these countries, we will be doing ourselves and to these countries a great deal of good. But coming back to the whole area of advanced and critical technologies, this is the area of the future. This is where China has gained advantage in some areas, even over the West, and we need to catch up. We need to catch up in the semiconductor area, electronics, uh, in general, for which uh, we can make domestic efforts, but we need foreign assistance, investment, and everything else. So that is one area on which we have to move forward in a very determined and well thought out manner, in which I think we're trying to do. Uh, there is uh, the other thing, of course, is uh, the stability of the government in India, in the sense that the kind of polarization that we see in the United States, we see to some extent in India. I, it's a bit, it's a bit disappointing how even the opposition is trying to diminish India's success in the handling of G20, sniping away at it. Um, but we need uh, we need a strong, stable government, not a coalition government, not a hodgepodge government, preferably a single majority government, which can then push uh, the reforms that our system needs. Uh, Therefore, the 2024 elections become important uh, in this regard. Now, whether and there can be more than one view, uh, whether in terms of social harmony, this and that, uh, what is happening in India uh, is is not desirable, or it should be handled differently. You can always have different views on it. But my own view would be that this is an inevitable part of the the growth of India as a self-confident country, which wants to have an identity of its own. It has had a kind of a mixed identity so far, and now the effort is that as we rise, as we become stronger, uh, we should have a specific identity of our own. This doesn't mean that we don't relate to the rest of the world. On the contrary, we remain open to the world, but open to the world as Bharat, if you like, in some ways. In some ways, so that is another challenge that the government, that the country, the society has to has to face. Um, I can't think of anything else
And Dr.
that.
Beckett, let me ask you, because that was going to be my last question, and you preempted it, so that's wonderful. One of the things that was noticed today, of course, was not only the which had been commented on earlier, that the invitation said, President of Bharat and Prime Minister of Bharat. Even today, in front of the Prime Minister, the sort of the tag said Bharat, Prime Minister of Bharat. Tell us finally, What is your opinion on the nomenclature? The constitution allows both nomenclatures, Bharat and India. That's very clear. So either can be used. But if Bharat as a nomenclature takes precedence, what is your opinion about that?
You know, all of us, right from the time of independence, have been used to describing ourselves as India and as Indians. Uh, the English language part of our English language population of our country uh, has always spoken of India and Indians. That has been the preferred uh, nomenclature or description. Now, to shift from that to Bharat is a huge psychological change for the educated English speaking uh, part of our polity and our society. Uh, Technically, the constitution itself says India, that is Bharat. And there was discussion at the time of the Constituent Assembly why India should only be Bharat or Bharat, that is India, the reverse, that kind of a thing. Um, there are there would be people in India, especially uh, parts of the opposition in the southern part of the country, which may not uh, support this change in nomenclature because they'll associate it with the assertion uh, of the of Hindutva or the Hindu identity of India, uh, etc., etc. Uh, there can always be a question whether the timing was right or the timing was not right, whether this sort of a change should have been made post 2024 or whether it was better to do it prior to 2024. So these in a democratic society there can be different views and people can express them. Uh, but if you ask me personally, frankly, how can a country have an identity of its own when its name uh, has been has an origin outside the country? If you India is, I mean, you go back to Greek times or whatever. I mean, do we do we describe ourselves uh, in the way in which the others want to describe us, or should we describe ourselves in a way which comes from our indigenous roots? So, from that point of view, leaving aside the complexity of the matter and everything else, of kind, I think emotionally, I think if you identify yourself by the origins of this country, I think that is more desirable. More desirable.
Ambassador, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate you spending time and talking us through India's G20 efforts, what is coming after G20, its various endeavors around the world, and of course, concluding with the nomenclature for rising power that is India, of the rising power that is India. Thanks very much, Ambassador Sibal, for joining me from London. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.